Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Music History Project. Today we're going to be talking about Dr. Robert Moog. So we're going to be talking about Dr. Robert Moog, and you guys are missing out because we even have props out today on our production table.
It's inspirational.
Special occasion.
Yes. Yeah. And it's really great. We had to break it out of the collector's box and everything. So all the value is now gone, but it is creating quite the inspiration for us here.
This is exciting, too, because Dr. Robert Moog was indeed a pioneer in the music products industry and a good friend to many of us. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us to celebrate his life and his achievements. And I guess this is all based on the oral history interview for the NAMM archives that we conducted with Dr. Robert Moog. And we're excited that you're going to be joining us as we play that interview and talk a little bit about his contributions.
Now, we've actually interviewed him twice in the program, but currently we only have his latter, the second interview, up online, and that's the one we're going to be referencing today. So if you have any interest in checking out the first one, don't hesitate to drop us a line at library@nam.org, and we can see what we can do for you. But this is going to be the second interview with Dr. Moog that took place in... Do we know when?
February. I don't know. No, I don't know.
Well, I'll look that up. And then we'll come back right shortly because Mike will do a good job editing. All right, so that interview date was January 21st, 2005. That was some pretty speedy research.
That was pretty good. That was some pretty good editing, too.
Yeah. I swear there wasn't a 20-minute break in between. And it looks like from our records, Dan, that shortly after our second interview with Dr. Moog, just a few minutes later is actually when he passed away.
Yeah, very sadly. Absolutely. Within our industry, he's a giant because of the man he was, in addition to the innovations that he created. Outside the industry, he's really well known as the father of the synthesizer. And for those who had the opportunity to engage him in any capacity, whether it was at the NAMM show or here at the Museum of Making Music in Carlsbad, he was so accessible and always interested in talking to people. And I think the warmth of the man is just as compelling as the brilliance of what he was able to create electronically as far as musical instruments go. So I'm really fascinated by this podcast because it gives us an opportunity to share his legacy.
So let's jump right in and hear from Dr. Moog.
Good morning, Bob.
Good morning.
Was it electronics or music that led you towards the creation of the Moog synthesizer?
It was more electronics than music, but it was also music. I had been taking piano lessons since the age of 4, so I knew about music, and the idea of playing another instrument and building another instrument was related somehow to that.
In the beginning, in your earlier instruments, was a keyboard incorporated in your instruments?
No, keyboard came later, and it in the very earliest years of working on a synthesizer from, say, 1964 through 1968. Keyboard was just one way of controlling the instrument. Now, once Switched On Bach came out, and it became evident that you could make real traditional music with the synthesizer, then suddenly a lot of mainstream musicians wanted to be able to play it, and for that they needed keyboards.
So we mentioned having props out earlier, and our prop has to do with the next section of the interview you're going to hear, and it is a really awesome, I don't even know how to describe it, figurine?
Action figure?
Action figure. I mean, it doesn't have any action to it.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's of the band leader Raymond Scott. Oh, and Dan's now moving it around, making him dance. So it's Raymond Scott playing a piano, 2 separate pieces, assembly required. And it's pretty neat. The box is really colorful. I don't know. You're lucky if you have one.
He's got a nice pose, too.
He does. But he's not playing with the correct form for the piano. He's got a single finger. He's like chicken pecking the keyboard there.
Well, what you can't see is it actually is not a piano.
Oh, it's not? Oh, I had the back view of it.
I'm giving her a closer look. Raymond Scott was a band leader and a composer. He was born in 1908, passed away in 1994, and had a huge career with music during the late 1940s and early 50s. In fact, many of his recordings became songs for cartoons during that time. And things like Huckleberry Duck come to mind, and Powerhouse were songs that are probably very recognizable once you hear them, if you've ever listened to Warner Brother cartoons during that time. And in addition to that career, he also tinkered with electronic musical instruments and created his own set of instruments as a result, and was an inspiration, as we're going to hear, of Dr. Robert Moog. Now, an interesting little side note, we are actually in the process of digitizing a radio interview that I had with Mr. Scott just about 2 weeks before he had a stroke that left him unable to speak. So I believe it's the very last interview that was ever conducted with him. And a very fascinating guy. I think he's basically has a cult following of folks, maybe because of the cartoons, maybe because of the electronic instruments that he created, and maybe because of his personality. He was a very charming guy who had a lot to say. So I think it's wonderful that we have an opportunity to further his own legacy by chatting with him, or about him rather, today, and listening to what Dr. Moog has to say about him.
So let's hear from Dr. Moog talking about Raymond Scott.
Was Raymond Scott a big help in your early designs?
I wouldn't say so. In fact, I think it was the other way around. We did work for Scott, and Scott was rather secretive about what he was doing. We knew he was doing quite a bit, but he was very cagey about telling us what he did.
So next up, we're going to talk about a different kind of instrument that we really haven't touched on yet in this podcast, and that is the Theremin. Now, the Theremin was the first electronic instrument that you were able to buy, and it's a really strange, different way to play type of instrument, different than like a stringed instrument or drums or a piano or anything like that. And you actually use your arms and where your body's positioned to create these really eerie sounding electronic sounds. The best way I could describe it is watch any horror movie and anytime there's like a scary scene where something pops out, it's usually a theremin that they're using. Yes,
apparently there's a ghost in here as well. So
Dan impersonating a theremin. And Dr. Moog was super into theremins, as well as somebody else that we've interviewed.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting to me is the influence that theremin had on Bob Moog. Bob was greatly influenced. In fact, looked at some of those hobbyist magazines in the early 50s and sent away with a couple of dollars to get a kit and building his own theremin as a kid. And that really, I think, was a great inspiration to Robert Moog. And what's interesting to me is that the concept of the theremin really is that there's two oscillators that are pointing to each other to create a pitch, similar to those old-fashioned radios that you had in your car where you would turn the dial, and in between finding a station, you'd hear that static, that woo, and that's basically oscillators looking for a frequency. And what theremin came up with was the concept of manipulating that by having your hand interfere between those two oscillators and creating a different pitch or frequency. And what Bob realized was it's too difficult to just wave your hands in front of this box to be consistent. You can't do it over and over again. And certainly it'd be very difficult to teach somebody else because what your body mass is different than the next person. So Bob essentially took that concept and put it to a keyboard and created the synthesizer. That's the simplistic way of saying it, but it was definitely a major influence. Well, about that same time, somewhere in the middle, there was a gentleman up in Berkeley named Don Buchla who was working on very similar processes. And while he didn't go commercial and create a synthesizer like Bob did that became purchasable, he definitely did a lot of research and a lot of development in that field. And what I'd love to play for you now is just a quick segment from our 2011 interview with Don Buchla, who actually had a couple of opportunities to meet Mr. Theremin, who was, by the way, a Russian physicist who, because he worked for the KGB, had a hard time leaving his country. He knew too much, as it were. So here's Don Buchla.
I liked it. I liked it a lot. And I later met Theremin and, in fact, appeared on the stage with him. And he was a fun guy. 90 years old, but...
What was that occasion?
He was brought out here by the Stanford people when they celebrated their 100th anniversary. And I played a ridiculous piece called En Plein Vol. And he appeared a little earlier with his daughter and with another astounding theremin player. There were quite a few pieces on that concert. It was a fun concert. And later I encountered him, or earlier actually, in Bourges. He was in one of the Bourges festivals, and I played quite a few of the Bourges festivals. So we met there also.
What sort of guy was he? Traditional Russian?
Oh, he was pretty wild, particularly in his youth.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, he has a crazy story. His life story is pretty interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I remember the dancing girls. They were dancing on the theremin, and they had short skirts and pretty risque for the day in Russia. He developed other instruments than the theremin. That's the one he's known for.
But he never really got into synthesis, I guess.
No, I don't think so. No. But he was very conscious of timbre, very aware of it, and built an instrument that had an extremely rich timbre, if not a great variety, but it was certainly amazing. He did what he did without the assistance of an oscilloscope, without being able to view the waveforms that he was dealing with. It's amazing what he accomplished with an instrument with 4 or 5 tubes in it. Or I guess that varied, but he was an idol of mine. And of Moog's, of course, who got even further into the theremins.
It's kind of interesting that your inspirations are kind of parallel in the sense that he was inspired by, or not inspired, but he was working on a non-musical project in a listening device, right? And that he came up with the theremin concept, and you were looking at a non-musical device that you raised the question of creating an intentional musical machine.
Theremin was certainly built that as an intentional musical instrument. He was unfortunately an expert in radar, and during the war couldn't travel to the U.S. In fact, it was many, many years later. I remember a person in Bourges trying to get him to come to Bourges, and she called the Soviet Secret Service and had to get special permission. She actually got in on the phone lines, and she, of course, spoke very fluent Russian, and she got in on the KBV phone lines or whatever, talked the right people into letting him have a visa to get out of the country. He hadn't been out of the... I met him when he first came into France. He was driven there by his, I believe, by his daughter.
What year was that?
Oh, it was in the 70s, but I don't remember exactly what year.
And so it was even after that he could come to the U.S., I guess.
Yes, it was after that he made it to the U.S. But this one woman worked very diligently for some time to get him out of Russia. They didn't want to let anybody out that would know anything about radar.
And now here's Dr. Moog talking about theremins and the beginning of his career.
I know you worked with theremins from a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever try to make a better theremin? Was that a start for what you ended up with?
I learned what a good theremin was as I went along. When I began, I built my first theremin at the age of 14, and it was from a do-it-yourself project. A theremin was a big mystery back then. There were only a few hundred in existence, and I'd never actually seen one or heard one. And then I think my mother found in a record store, she found an album of 78s was on special sale because one of the records had broken. And it was Perfume Set to Music by Dr. Samuel Hoffman, Harry Ravel, I believe. And then I knew what the theremin was supposed to sound like. But it took me many years to learn what a good theremin was, and by and large it was what Leon Theremin himself did. So I made a lot of mistakes in the early days, and gradually learned the same thing that Leon Theremin himself learned.
You know, we just spoke about a keyboard on the synthesizers.
Mm-hmm.
The theremin is so in opposition with having a keyboard because all the notes kind of glide together.
Mm-hmm.
Did that change your musical taste at all to deal with theremins? Did it get you into microtonal music?
I'm sure it did. It certainly acquainted me with the possibilities of changing the quality of sound by electronic means, and of making sounds that were with gliding pitch that you don't learn when you play the piano. Gradually my ears did. For sure I developed a better sense of pitch. I never had that good a sense of pitch as a piano player. I could play the right keys, but if one key was a little bit out of tune, it was not something I had to worry about. But in playing the theremin, you have to have a very good ear, and I developed my ear as time went on.
Did you ever try to change the timbral quality of the theremins?
Yeah, I did. I experimented with changing the waveform, with adding individual overtones. And the first instrument that I described in a magazine article, that was in 1954, was an instrument that offered several timbre variations.
You said that you started working on theremins at a young age.
Mm-hmm.
I had read that you started working on theremins with your father.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Could you elaborate on that, please?
My father had a complete shop in the basement of our house. And he was a very good all-around woodworker, and he was an electrical engineer himself, so he knew about electronics. And in fact, he was one of the very earliest amateur radio operators, licensed amateur radio operators. So he knew a little bit about electronic circuitry and about building electronic equipment. And I used to like to work with him. I learned how to, in my first experiences with electronics were doing things with him. And also my first experience making something out of wood or something out of steel were with him.
When you entered your formal electronics education,
Mm-hmm.
what did your teachers think of you working in these different electronic musical instruments?
It was transparent to them. When I started my engineering education, this is now my 4th year in college, began my engineering education. I was very busy and I didn't have much chance to indulge in hobbies, electronics or otherwise. It was a big engineering class. The individual classes were formal and large. The professor got up and talked, and he didn't have much of an idea of what his students were interested in. Not he just told you the engineering things you had to know.
When did you start incorporating innovation into pre-existing technology?
Well, it's hard to identify an abrupt point, but a lot of what I did, even in the early days, was ideas that seemed right to me. I had no way of knowing whether they were innovation or not. If they just seemed right, and I think it was that way. It was always that way. And little by little, the contributions I made to the state of electronic musical instrument art became more and more substantial. As I learned what other people did and avoided doing the same thing myself.
Were you met with acceptance or resistance when your professors started to realize your pursuits?
Well, by the time I was a graduate student, I had a little part-time business. The Theremins were pretty good by that time. Now we're talking in the late 50s, early 60s. And I spent quite a bit of time building instruments myself, one at a time. I had a sales representative, a man by the name of Arnold Carl Westfall, who was an itinerant preacher. And he introduced the theremin to a lot of people like him who went from church to church, putting on services that were very often musically based. And the theremin turned out to be very good for that sort of thing. So he was out there getting sales, and I was taking the time to fill those orders. And my thesis advisor eventually found out what I was doing. It's nothing I ever brought into the university. It's just, it sort of leaked out that I was working on this, and he started to put up the heat on me to finish finish my doctoral dissertation, so that then I could do what I want, and he wouldn't have to put up with me.
So would we consider that the beginning of Moog Music as a company?
It was very much a part-time business. Starting in 1954, there was something called the R.A. Moog Company, but that was my father and me. And once I left home, it was just me, just one part-time person. The first time that I think you could call it a serious business was in 1964, when I decided to more or less become a full-time business, even though my doctoral dissertation wasn't quite done. And my thesis advisor put up with that for about 1 year. And then one night at 9 o'clock, when we were, the whole group of us, finishing a special custom order for John Cage, and it wasn't going well. There was some problem with the components we were using. It was 9 o'clock at night. My thesis advisor called me up and he said, Moog, he said, whatever is not on my desk 10 o'clock tomorrow morning is not going in your thesis. Good night. And that's how I finished my PhD thesis. So I guess by that point, the company existed as a full-time company, and that was 1965. And I had already taken orders for synthesizer modules then.
Who were your clients?
Mostly composers in universities, experimental composers. A few private experimental composers, and very occasionally someone in the commercial field who had the foresight to understand what could be done with this funny electronic stuff.
So we just got done hearing from Dr. Moog talking about the start of his career, like Mike mentioned early, as well as the last little bit talking about some of his early clients, which I found exceptionally interesting. And I wanted to ask you two guys, why do you think at the beginning of his work he had such a hard time kind of getting people to, adopt or... Nobody
was doing it.
Right.
I think really what happened was when Walter Carlos finally made that very famous record, Hooked on Bach, using the Moog, it really wasn't until that moment where most people realized that this could be musical. Up until that point, it's my assessment that most of it was just kind of generating sounds and pitches and bleeps and blurps and not necessarily something that could be rhythmic. And of course, Walter Carlos's album sort of single-handedly proved all of that completely wrong. It totally could be and was, and I think that was a huge influence. In fact, I hear about that recording probably more than any other when talking to folks who were influenced by music of the 1960s, because that really ushered in a great amount of creativity amongst artists and composers. And of course, a lot of those folks wound up being in the music products industry and helping with things like the Roland synthesizers and EMU and others that were looking to take it to the next step.
So do you think before that point people would have classified Dr. Moog's work more as like engineering and science as opposed to music related?
I think so. I mean, that's a good question. I think that there were definitely some recordings. The Beatles, for example, incorporated the Moog, so it was musical. It's just that it wasn't as accessible.
So then I guess my follow-up question would be, has there been any innovation or musical invention or anything like that since then that you think could be compared to that kind of revolutionized the way music has been perceived? I don't think it's the same thing, but I think you could draw similarities from maybe like iPads and iPhones and mobile recording studios and that kind of thing, on how it's totally different and people aren't really used to it yet. So it's gaining some traction, but people are still, they want to do it the old school way, as everybody says, just because they're used to it. But I see in the future mobile things just being a lot more prevalent than they are now. So maybe that's kind of similar, but I mean, I don't know anything that like instrument wise that's coming out that's totally different than... Right. The only thing I could see maybe like even remotely, and it would be a really big stretch, would be like the adoption of the drum machine as opposed to that, like just the kind of hesitance that the community had to incorporate it. Yeah, I could see that. Or like the other day we were talking about EDM music, and like the sampling of it is not always interpreted as being creative. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. It's when it comes to creating music in a much more simple way these days, it's definitely frowned upon just because people aren't used to it. But maybe that's the same kind of concept going on. I also think that what was revolutionary about the Moog, certainly the first series of them, the Mini Moog included,
was the accessibility of it. Here you had sounds being created on albums by artists like the Beatles, but it wasn't accessible to you as an artist, as a guy in the garage or tinkering around, or somebody in school interested in this kind of thing, until these products came to your local music store. Like I say, Don Buchla was working on things prior to this, so was Raymond Scott and a few others. So what Dr. Moog did was give us, the consumer, the musician, the opportunity to tinker with it ourselves and create our own sound and our own voice. And I think that is difficult to say it's been duplicated, because of course it has been. There's been lots of products that have come out that have inspired people, but to the mass, it's unlikely that anything has been as impactful as the synthesizer. And
maybe that's just the attitude of, now that Dr. Moog has kind of broken the dynamics and the strict kind of perception of what is a musical instrument and what isn't, now that kind of like glass ceiling had been shattered by him, maybe nothing else could ever do that, because it all can be accepted, because look at what he's gained approval of. I don't know. So we're going to hear more in this next segment about Dr. Moog's work and a lot of the inspiration and some songs and recordings his work was used on, as well as trying to connect instruments and make his products more accessible to the average musician.
Were there any novelty songs that came out in the 60s that you recall that had your instruments in them, and they became famous because of the sounds of your instruments?
In the late 60s, there were many so-called Moog records. Well, what happened was that after the first few years of our making synthesizer equipment for avant-garde and experimental composers, various people from the pop music field and the musical mainstream began to learn what we were doing and began their own experimentation. Dick Hyman was still is a well-known keyboard player, and he made 2 albums. Well, one of them was called simply Moog, big letters, M-O-O-G. And one of the tunes on that achieved popularity at the time was called The Minotaur. And Dick Hyman is a very good musician, so anything he does sounds good. The really big record at that time, of course, was Switched on Bach, that came out at the end of 1968. And, there were a few novelties before that, but after that there was just a huge amount of people in the music business rushing in to capitalize on the success of Switched on Bach.
Did that commercial success start to change your direction?
Yes. As soon as Switched on Bach came out, maybe 90% or 95% of our orders were for modular synthesizers with keyboards. And, gradually the production of traditional tonal music became much more important than it was in the mid-60s when we were just beginning. See, when we were first beginning, what these experimental composers were interested in was in composing timbres, having different sounds and putting one type of sound in relation to another type of sound. Melody, harmony, and traditional rhythm wasn't as important. And we just didn't emphasize the accurate control of pitch at that time because it wasn't important to these early composers. But after Switched on Bach, the accurate control of pitch, the ability to play notes from a keyboard, they became very important.
Was sequencing a major part of what you built in the early synthesizers?
No. That's one of the big differences between what Don Buchla did and what we did. from the very beginning of Don's work, and actually Don began working before I began building synthesizers. His work preceded mine by about a year, I think. And the idea of sequencers, analog sequencers, was basic to his instruments. Now, eventually, we did introduce a sequencer, and I'll be happy to admit that it's Don's work that gave us the idea for how to do that. When we introduced the sequencer, it was another facility for making patterned sounds, but still the keyboard was the most important way of controlling the sounds.
Patterned sounds were so integral to 70s music,
Yeah.
the disco craze.
Yeah.
Did that start to change your focus to where you incorporated more sequencers or timing sequences of, let's say, arrays of sounds? Did that change your focus a lot for the 70s? In other words, were your instruments designed around the music, or did the music start to design the instruments in the 70s?
We had a sequencer, one model of sequencer. And as our instruments went from being modular in the 60s to being integrated complete units like the Mini Moog in the 70s, we didn't have anything beyond that one model of sequencer that could be used. And, I don't think that the ability to make patterns automatically was that important for the design of our instruments all the way through the 70s.
Did you start to respond for the need for more sounds by coming up with some sort of an interface between your instruments? In other words, between different models of the instruments?
Yeah.
In the 70s?
The way it went was that in the 60s we developed a modular synthesizer. And most of the instruments that we introduced in the 70s were subsets of that modular capabilities. The Mini Moog is the capability of 1, 2, 3, maybe a dozen modules sort of stuffed into one box. And instruments like the Micro Moog are even fewer, and the Rogue are even fewer than that. So, in terms of flexibility and ability to make wide ranges of sound, the modular synthesizers were then and still are the best thing to use. But during the 70s, it was more a marketing exercise, picking price points and getting the right feature set to meet that price point.
Did you have requests to start connecting all these different instruments that you had made? Did people have a collection of your instruments and want to interconnect them?
Well, they could. For instance, the Mini Moog Model D that we introduced in 1970 had 3 control inputs and a gate input. That could be used in combination with modular stuff. Not too many people did that, but the capability was there. And throughout the 70s, we introduced some accessory controllers. There was a drum, there was a little sample and hold module, there was a ribbon controller, and you could plug any of these things in at all to control the Mini Moog or some of the other models that were introduced in the 70s.
How did you respond to questions during the 70s, people asking for the ability to be able to connect, let's say, your keyboard up with an Oberheim synthesizer? Did you ever come up with any special interface to be able to interconnect synthesizers of different manufacturers?
By and large, the 1 volt per octave control of pitch by external control voltage was accepted by most of the synthesizer manufacturers. The idea of being able to turn a bunch of knobs on this machine and have the sound from this machine follow all those knobs, that rarely came up. Because what this machine did was basically different from what this machine did. There was no MIDI then. There was connection via control voltage. Tom Oberhein's instruments and also Dave Smith's instruments were the first polyphonic instruments, and they developed special digital interfaces. I didn't participate. I personally didn't participate up until the time I left Norlin at the end of 1978.
Did you have requests for divider circuits or multiplier circuits to increase the control voltage or change the control voltage so that it could communicate with 1.5 volt per octave instruments?
It's possible that questions like that came up, but the answers were very easy. Most modular synthesizers had the ability to process control voltage to change the scale of any of the voltages. That was a very simple thing to do.
What was your impression of this notion of interconnecting synthesizers of different manufacturers with a digital interface?
Well, all that became possible after I left Norlin. I think the state of the art when I left, I said before that it was the end of 78. It wasn't. It was the end of 77. But the state of the art was that the only instruments that were using digital control were very large instruments like the Fairlight and the Synclavier. They didn't have much to do with control voltages at all. They were completely in the digital domain. So the analog instruments that we built throughout the 70s, up until the time I left Norlin, had no real capability of being controlled by digital interfaces, and it's true the other way around. Today we all take for granted that musicians have digital workstations, they have digital controllers, they have digital synthesizers. The first, as I remember it, the first all-digital instrument to become important to musicians was the Yamaha DX7. They were experimenting up to that, but it was mostly the sort of thing that they'd show it at a show, and there'd be 2 or 3 engineers behind, in the next room waiting to go in and fix it should it break. It was not something that the dealers were involved in, the musical instrument dealers were involved in, until Yamaha made this incredible breakthrough of the DX7. So until that happened, it was unthinkable to, well, not unthinkable, but nobody thought that much about standardizing on the interface so that instruments of different manufacturers could be played together.
Well, I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I am. It's always fascinating to get in the middle of an interview with somebody who is as compelling as Dr. Moog was. I also wanted to mention, while we're talking about some of the staff and engineers that he hired and worked with, several of them we were lucky enough over the years to interview as part of the NAMM Oral History program. So web clips from each of these are available on our website. Herb Deutsch, Dave Luce, David Van Covering, and even Tom Ray, who went on to become a professor over at Berkeley, was one of the early sales reps for the company when Bob was first starting out in the 1960s.
And Mike, what's that web address they can go to again?
That is www.namm.org/library.
That was very like PBS,
I've been
like
practicing.
NPR. You're going to move on to bigger and better things here soon.
don't say that.
You have no idea how I can fly.
Again, don't say that. Okay, so now we're going off to another segment of Dr. Robert Moog's NAMM Oral History interview, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the sources that he used, as well as how the instrument developed in the 1970s.
Would you consider the Moog source and the Poly Moog to be the closest step into new synthesis?
The Moog source was just a basic two-voice instrument. What it had in it is the ability to control to store panel settings, but it was still completely analog and completely. It was very similar to what had been built up until then. I don't think it sounds very different. The Poly Moog is an all-analog instrument, but it uses a different sort of sound shaping. It uses organ technology, top-octave synthesizer, and divide-down circuits to make all the notes. And every note had a little envelope generator and filter on it. So it was basically a different architecture, but it was still all analog.
If I have one final question to ask you.
Yeah.
If an asteroid passed by the Earth and rendered no electricity,
yeah,
would you still make musical instruments?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I love musical instruments. Whenever people make musical instruments, they use the most sophisticated technologies and the most up-to-date materials of the time. When people made drums back, 5,000 years, 10,000 years ago, that was high tech. That they used the sharpest chisels they could find and the sharpest knives, the best stone, and they got the best log they could get. And I would do the same thing. Sure.
I'm very curious about what motivated you, or who motivated you to start to think in terms of making the Moog more mobile and something that someone could take on the road during a tour.
Well, it wasn't so much a toury thing. What it was we were in the 60s. We were designing modular systems, and we had two types of cabinets: a console cabinet and a portable cabinet. And that was the beginning. You could buy a large synthesizer that would be in 3 or 4 cabinets, and each one had a handle on it, and you could load it into a truck, or it was portable. You wouldn't want to, carry it very far, but it was portable. So that was the beginning. And after this year or two in the late 60s of all these Moog records coming out, a lot of the people who learned how to use these modular systems began saying, we'd like to have something we could take on with us on a session. They were session musicians. Can you put something in one suitcase that I can take myself without hiring a truck or a bunch of roadies? And that's what the Mini Moog was supposed to be. When we designed the Mini Moog, our model user of the Mini Moog was a session musician. We didn't think of people playing this stuff on stage.
And then, what were your impressions of Keith Emerson during that time?
Gosh. Well, I'm trying to think exactly when I saw Keith play. It was the first time I ever saw him play was in Gaelic Park in New York City, and I think it was on their first tour. I'd never seen anything like it. I come from a generation where we listened to cool jazz, and we danced to Stan Kenton and Maynard Ferguson, people like that, and rock and roll was sort of going on off to the side. Even for me, of course we knew about the Beatles and the Stones, but I'd never actually been to one of those concerts. And seeing Keith Emerson on stage with his organ and his knife, and playing this big modular synthesizer, it was a hoot. It was. I remember feeling incredibly exhilarated.
Could you see the seeds of potential things to come from that show?
I suppose so. I never thought too much about the future because it's a process. It was always the next thing to do and the next thing. And I never did, and I still don't worry too much about what's going to be happening 5 or 10 years from now.
So that was really fascinating. It's great to hear Dr. Robert Moog talk about Keith Emerson, who, of course, was an icon in the music industry and a good friend of NAMM. He often was behind a NAMM booth. I remember first meeting him in 2000 and was lucky enough to interview Keith for the NAMM Oral History program back in 2009. He was born in 1944, by the way, passed away just last year, 2016. It also reminded me of a couple of other musicians that we've been lucky enough to interview who were very inspired by the Moog. George Duke comes to mind. We were lucky enough to interview him, John Eaton, and just to hear how they added their own personal creativity to the Moog, I think was very humbling for Dr. Moog. He mentioned that a couple of different times in conversations that I had. One here at the Museum of Making Music in Carlsbad, where he was very humbled by the fact that these guys that he idolized, not being a musician himself, were able to take his creation and elevate it with their own passion and skills.
And now let's hear from Dr. Moog, kind of reflecting a little bit on his career now that he is getting towards the end of his career and everything, just looking back on it all.
Is there a time in your career, the development of your products, that you sometimes look back and say, what was I thinking if I just done that differently? Is there anything that stands out?
All the time. I suppose so. I suppose the first thing is, why did I listen to the early experimenters or experimental musicians who said they weren't interested in pitch? Why did I do that? Because our oscillators were hard to keep in tune, the early oscillators.
And actually, Ed and Jim here on the crew, we just went to the floor and we got a little bit of B-roll of you. And Ed was observing, here you are in this, it's a nice sized booth, but it's relatively small to some. And you sometimes look around and say, if it really wasn't for me and some of the people I worked with, this whole area of this convention floor may not be here, or maybe it wouldn't be what it is today. Does that ever dawn on you, what you contributed?
It dawns on a lot of people who come around and say hello to me. If that was said to me once in the last 2 days, it's been said 100 times. Who can tell what would happen if something else didn't happen? I think it was in the air that the idea. In the air is an old-fashioned way of describing it. It was on the network, and the network is the air, but it's also what ties us all together in the air. And it was out there. All you had to be is a little tuned in, and you could feel it. And I just happened to, be tuned in and ready to do something at that time. Other people would have come in, and maybe things would have been a little bit different, and maybe not.
I know you mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily think so much to the future, but seeing all that's gone on in the last 25 years, who could have imagined? Where do you see it going, or where would you like to see all this going? When you think of the end user and the people that other people watch perform with musical instruments, where would you like to see it go?
I'd like to see it somehow continuing to bring people together. A lot of musical idioms today and the technological means of distributing music are going in a direction of separating the musicians from each other and separating the musicians from the listeners. And I think electronics as a technology is capable of going the other way, and that's what I'd like to see happen. I think it's so important that we use technology to build up communities of listeners, of participators, participants. Participators. Where'd that come from?
So next we're going to hear Dr. Moog talking about MIDI, and for those that don't know, MIDI is basically a way for different electronic instruments to communicate with each other. And before MIDI, there was really no standard for instruments, and it was difficult to make a certain keyboard work with another one. But with MIDI, all of those problems were gone, and it was the universal language for these instruments. So we're going to hear Dr. Moog talk about the development of it and how it really changed everything for the better.
What were you thinking? Were you surprised, and what were your thoughts when eventually they came up with the common protocol? Did it shock you that it happened, or did you see it coming?
No, it all seemed very natural. 2 years before MIDI was announced officially, Dave Smith and one of his colleagues gave a talk where he described the basic ideas that became MIDI. And he described it at an Audio Engineering Society convention. It seemed like a very good idea at the time. I can remember when MIDI was first being formed, there was interest by a few people in this country, but as I remember it now, the Japanese manufacturers were quicker to see the importance of MIDI. They were the ones who did the first work in actually getting it into instruments and getting it out to where it could be demonstrated and sold at a place like the NAMM show here. I can remember doing an interview for a magazine article I wrote in 1983 or 1984 when my old company, Moog Music, was saying, well, we're just, I was told this, we're just watching to see how it develops. But we don't know how important this is going to be. In the meantime, Roland and Yamaha and of course Dave's sequential circuits are just plowing ahead.
And speaking of that, how difficult was it to sell a company that you put your life into and then eventually recover the name back? Was that just a difficult time for you, or it's just part of doing business?
The answer to the question is yes. It was both a difficult thing to do, and it was part of doing. It's something we had to do. I was never one to do financial planning all that well, or to raise money all that well, and that's what it comes down to.
And then finally, talking about the convention floor and people coming up to, I know you just finished a film, and then along with this convention, what's it make you feel like to see all of these different people and getting an opportunity to see them again on a fairly routine basis, and just talk about what you love, and that's making sounds?
Well, that's where the reward comes. I'm an engineer. I like my electronics well enough. That's fun. But over the years, it's the people you meet, both the musicians who use our stuff and the fellow engineers. To me, that's what it's all about.
You were talking about it in the era, being that particular era of development. I think a good way to go at it a different way and maybe get what we want is, how would you compare that era of the 60s and into the early 70s when you were developing, maybe to compare it to now? Was there a distinction between what's being developed now and how it's being developed and what was going on back then?
Well, back in the 60s, most electronic musical instrument designs were tone generators that were fixed in pitch. there was a great emphasis on being fixed. And somehow, after talking with these experimental composers, the idea of it being necessary to make the pitch programmable and dynamic made sense to me, and I went in a different direction because of that. And the reason I went there, I think, there are three parts to the reason. One part is that's what the musicians wanted. The second part is that the technology, what was becoming available in electronics, allowed one to do that in a more practical way than it was available before that. And the third is it's something between an idea and a feeling, just a sense that this is going to be useful. And that sense, that sense just comes from outside, and it comes outside because of the energy, the creative energy that's in the air, that is contributed to by millions, billions of people. This is not something you can take a picture of or stick a microphone on or analyze with a computer. But if you are sensitive, if you do have the right feeling and the right way of looking at something, you can pick up this sort of awareness. I think that today, one thing I could point to that might illustrate what I see today is the iPod. The iPod is possible because of the current sophistication of digital electronics. But it's a particular combination of features turned out to be very successful. It's selling a lot of iPods now, but it wasn't obvious to everybody when the iPod first came out that it was going to be this successful. And it's the insight that the people at Apple had in designing it, and they got that insight from out here, from the energy, what everybody wants and what everybody's thinking. And they're just lucky they were tuned in to the right part of that.
So that concludes our interview with Dr. Robert Moog, but we have a little bonus content at the end here, where we're actually going to hear from his daughter, who has kind of taken over preserving the legacy of her father. She works with the Moog Foundation. Is that correct, Dan?
That's right. She created that in a way of utilizing what her father had started, which is creativity that inspires others to make music, and utilizing some school curriculum and some other sources. Michelle has really done a fantastic job keeping her father's flame very well in the forefront of inspiration. And it was a real pleasure to interview her as part of the NAMM Oral History program. So as Elizabeth said, we wanted to play just a little bit of the clip from her.
We've taken Theremins, synthesizers, and Moog into the schools in the local area. We're in Asheville, North Carolina, to great effect. One of our volunteers, our creative director, David Hamilton, has kind of spearheaded that effort, and the response has been just great. The kids absolutely love it. The Theremin provides such an interesting interface to engage kids in the science behind the sound, which is something we're trying to teach kids. And they've really been turned on by it. And it's interesting because it's kind of across the board. Kids who are not otherwise engaged in their curriculum have engaged in that. And the teachers have really, really enjoyed it as well. Mm-hmm. We've also taken these interactive setups with the Theremins and Moog and the synths out to area festivals and regional festivals, and just kind of educated people on how to play them, and what some of the basic physics and science is behind the sound. And people love it, because I think people know it, but they don't understand it, and they certainly don't have access to it. And to just so easily be able to get your hands on it and just wander with it, it really engages people. We have pictures of, a 1-year-old tweaking the knobs on a Moog and an 80-year-old playing a theremin with this like light bulb expression on their face. So that is part of how we're carrying out our mission. The other part is just trying to preserve Bob Moog's extensive archive, because there's a lot of its inspiration and education to be found in those archives. And the final way is the creation of the Moogseum. We are planning to construct a Bob Moog Museum, or Moogseum, in Asheville, North Carolina, in probably 3 to 5 years. We just received our first big grant for that project. And that's going to kind of be the nexus of our goals, but it's going to be highly interactive and educational. Yeah, so we are reaching out. We're a small organization, but reaching out as much as we can to carry on the legacy. And we'll be doing a lot more as well. And this, the exhibit at the museum is a way of doing that as well. I think part of the lesson that Bob Moog's legacy shares is, with a lot of perseverance and focus and determination, one person can make a huge impact. And I think that's a lesson that we can all take away from it and integrate in our own lives.
That was Michelle Moog, the daughter of Dr. Robert Moog. And you can really tell anytime you speak with her just how passionate she is for continuing music advocacy and making sure kids are learning instruments and getting them into their hands, which I think is phenomenal. We need more people like her and her team out there promoting that work. So that concludes our podcast for today. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening and subscribing, and we hope you go online and leave us some feedback, because we are always dying for positive feedback. And again, if you have any suggestions on future episodes, or you have any ideas of can't miss interviews that Dan needs to be conducting, then make sure you drop us a line at library@nam.org. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks.